Welcome to Madlik Disruptive Torah. This week we're rebroadcasting one of my favorite episodes from 2022, an episode about a single color that somehow contains an entire Jewish story. Tekhelet, that rare, stubborn, unforgettable blue. What makes this rebroadcast feel especially timely is that, as antisemitism re-emerges into public life, people are reaching for symbols again. Simple symbols that say, I'm here, I'm not hiding, and I'm not alone. One of these symbols is the Blue Square campaign, a small square of blue worn or posted as a public marker of solidarity. And here's the thing. Judaism has been thinking about the meaning of blue for a very long time. In the Torah, blue is not decoration. It's architecture woven into the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. It's authority worn by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And then it becomes something radical. It migrates from the sanctuary to the street, from the priest to every Jew, with the thread of tekhelet on the tzitzit, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The rabbis say tekhelet is chosen because it resembles the sea, and the sea resembles the sky, and the sky resembles the throne of glory. But the dramatic story of blue also includes scarcity, counterfeits, black markets, extinction of species and loss, until finally, for centuries, the blue disappears and all we have is white, which means sometimes what a symbol means is not only what it shows, but what it remembers. So, this week, while the world is rediscovering the power of a simple blue square, we're going to do what we do at Madlik: go back to the sources, trace the thread, and ask what blue has always been trying to say. Here's our rebroadcast: Why Blue and White? Tekhelet, Judaism's most charged color. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as a Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. Today we'll explore the Torah's preeminent use of a hue of blue called tekhelet in the construction of the tabernacle and in the priestly garb. This rare and dear dye, extracted from a non-kosher mollusk, was also used on the four-cornered talit of every simple Jew. So get ready to decorate and take out your color strips as we ask, why blue and white? Well, welcome. I think last week I said stay tuned for our fashion edition. Maybe it's going to be more like the Pantone edition or the pick the color for your wall edition. But in any case, here we are. We're starting to decorate our tabernacle. Last week, we had a lively discussion about why, after saying, build me a temple, God said, V'shachanti b'tocham, in it I will live in them. And over the week, I've been thinking about it, and I started to think that, maybe it foreshadowed a time already when you built the temple, when you built the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that you wouldn't have it. And I think that foreshadowing thought is going to come through a little bit in our discussion of the emergence and history of this wonderful hue of blue called tekhelet, how it starts and how, from the way it starts and its history, it foreshadows its later development. So we are in Exodus 26, and I am just going to pick those verses that mention our color. And you'll see that I'm not really looking for a needle in a haystack. This tekhelet, this blue, is actually featured throughout and grows with importance. So in Exodus 26:1, it says, As for the tabernacle, make it of 10 strips of cloth, make these of fine twisted linen, of blue, purple, and crimson yards, tekhelet v'argaman v'tolat shani. And then in Exodus 26, it says, make loops of blue wool on the edge of the outermost cloth of the one set, and do likewise on the edge of the outermost. So at first it's mentioned amongst another palette of different colors, and now all of a sudden it's the edging color. In Exodus 26:31, it says, you shall make a curtain of blue, parochet tekhelet. Those of you who know about synagogue architecture know what a parochet is. It is the frontal canopy in front of the holiest place in the synagogue. So you shall make a curtain of blue, purple, and crimson yards and fine twisted linen. It shall have a design of cherubim worked into it. In 26:36, it says, you shall make a screen for the entrance of the tent, petach ha'ohel, and it shall be blue, purple, and crimson yards. So blue is being featured regularly. And in fact, on this, if you look into the notes, I actually have some illustrations from a wonderful book called The Tabernacle, Its Structure and Utensils. And the figurative elements of the parochet are actually the cheruvim themselves are in blue. In Exodus 28:31, it says, you are to make the tunic for the ephod completely of this blue, kalil tekhelet. And of course, the ephod was almost a royal garment, a smock. It was it looked almost like an apron. So it was frontally, it's what you saw when you saw the high priest. In Exodus 28:36, it says, you shall make a frontlet, this tzitz, on the pure gold. And this is, of course, what the Kohen wore on his forehead. And it was made of gold, and engrave on it the seal of God, suspended on a cord of blue, a tekhelet, tekhelet, so that it shall remain on the headdress. So if you start to actually visualize this use of blue, it is, I would say, the preeminent color. I'd love to know what you think, Rabbi, but certainly when you look frontally at the Kohen, it's the smock, it's what he's wearing, and it's that golden name of God that sits on his forehead is tied with these patil tekhelet. So are you struck, as I am, by this use of this blue?
Yes, I am. And obviously, the blue is also in the talit. So it goes beyond the priest. But there's no question that this tekhelet, is the most significant color, not only in the Kohen's clothing, but I would say in the entire Torah. If you were to ask me, what is the color of the Torah, I would tell you the color of the Torah is tekhelet.
So the official color of the Torah, of the Israelites, of the Jewish people, becomes blue. And you've already begun our journey because you referenced the talit. In Numbers 15, it says, and we say this every day as the third paragraph of the Shema, and Hashem said to Moses as follows, speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garment. Va'asu lehem tzitzit al kanfei bigdeihem. Throughout the ages, let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner. Al tzitzit hakanaf petil tekhelet. There shall be for you a fringe. Look at it and recall all the commandments of God and observe them, so that you do not follow your heart and eyes in your lustful urge. Thus you shall be reminded to observe all my commandments and to be holy to God. I, God, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. To be your God, I am God. So that's almost, is it a fast forwarding? Is it a similar parallel to what we had last week, where with this direct connection between what happened institutionally in a tabernacle and what happens to individual Jews? I was kind of struck by that. Do you think there's anything there?
I wonder, and I think that the what's the connection? Well, first of all, let's say it like this. There clearly is a connection between the talit and the clothing of the Kohen, because they're both clothing. You have to remember, this is an important thing to remember. We wear the talit as a special garment. We wear it over our clothing. That's not what the Torah has in mind when it talks about a talit. When the Torah talks about a talit, it means that they used to wear these kaftans. And the kaftans had four corners, and they used to put tzitzis on the bottom of the kaftans. So it actually was their clothing. So there actually is a much closer connection between the description of the tekhelet in the talit and the clothing of the Kohen.
Absolutely, and again, there's forgive the pun. There's a thread that connects what happened in the tabernacle in terms of the aesthetic choice of color for the edifice itself, for the wearing of the high priest, and the way that a simple any Jew could wear. In a sense, we're going over some familiar territory. For those of you who have been with us for the past year, we had a fashion episode where we talked about Korach, who led a rebellion against God, and his argument, according to the rabbinic sources, was that he was wearing a talit shekulo tekhelet. And according to the Midrash, he didn't just bring an argument, he actually showed up with a bunch of Kohanim, and they were wearing this garment that was fully tekhelet. What I was struck by as I read this, and I considered what the ephod actually was that was actually very close to the garb that we are describing right now. If you looked at the Kohen, the predominant color would be this tekhelet. So in a sense, again, maybe foreshadowing a later time, but at the time that this was written, the Kohanim were set aside by wearing this blue. And if anything, the thread on the corners of the talit kind of reflected the total effect, if you will, the total look, the total fashion. But you can't get away from the fact that there has to be a connection. This is the first time that tekhelet, to my mind, is actually mentioned in the Torah, and it's mentioned in with regard to the tabernacle. And here, every Jew later on is commanded to simulate that in some regard. And I think that's kind of a powerful message.
I would agree with that. I mean, let's think about the tekhelet. Do you think the fact that it's blue is significant? I mean, like, it could be any color. And and in the Torah this week, there are other colors. Why is blue such an important color? So I'll tell you what the Midrash says. The Midrash says that when you look at the blue on the talit, you're supposed to think of the sea. When you think of the sea, then the blue of the sea. Then you're supposed to think of the blue of the heavens, and that reminds you of God. So the blue is actually a color that reminds you of God. It's a little indirect, but it reminds you of God. Isn't that interesting?
I think it is. And of course, if you add to that the tekhelet itself comes, according tradition, from a dye. We'll get into the history of the dye in a few minutes, but from a mollusk, which is in the sea. So form follows function type of thing. You look at the blue, it inspires you to think both by way of its origins and its color of the sea, then the sky, the firmament, and then God. And those are great associations. Those associations are in the Talmud, in the rabbinic literature. I think if you were to ask me, reading the text itself, what the association is, I would put it into the context of everything else that's in our parsha, which is very rare materials, beautifully selected stones that create this Urim v'Tumim, the very best, the hidur of the thing. And I would add, and this will come up in our discussion, very dear in the sense of very rare, very expensive, very exclusive by the laws of supply and demand, hard to come by. And so I think there's also, if you look at, for instance, the word ephod, this smock that I was describing, that was worn by King David and by King Solomon. These were royal garments, and to me, the most, I would say, straightforward association is in exclusivity, something that is of a very, very high value, hard to come by. Do you think there's any merit to that, as opposed to the associative thinking of what it reminds one of?
Good. I think that there is absolutely something to be said for that. Now, it's interesting when you think about supply and demand, Jeffrey. Where they get this mollusk from in the desert? How they have the color of tekhelet in the desert?
Well, I wasn't in your synagogue last week, so I didn't hear your sermon. But if I recall, you were going to talk about how many of the materials by tradition, rabbinic tradition, for the Mishkan were brought with the Jews down into Egypt. And I added to that there's much talk about when the Jews left Egypt, they were given riches. That worked for them and against them. When it came to the golden calf, they all seemed to have jewelry to contribute. But it is an issue. And, those who would question how this could have been done in the desert, either you believe in miracles or you don't. So I do think it's a good question, and obviously part of that is a mollusk. It comes from the sea, and here they are in a desert. That makes it a little bit more challenging.
Why I ask it specifically here is because the mollusk comes from the sea, and here they are in the desert.
No question about it. And again, I think that whether it's the Tabernacle, the Mishkan, or the Temple, one can make many cases that there is foreshadowing of what would become a Mishkan or what was to be a Mishkan. But I think that, it comes down to belief and perspective. But I think if you get over that, there is no question that the Kohanim in the tradition of giving honor to God and building cathedrals and beautiful edifices were decked out in the best. And that there's no question that tekhelet, to me, has a level of royal blue to it. And that comes out, I think, a little bit in Korach's argument as well, where he's looking for authority. He's looking for exclusive power, a grabbing, so to speak. So I think from that perspective, it becomes fascinating if one traces the history of the use of tekhelet directly from being used by a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, and then ultimately being part of, if even with a thread, of a Pashut Yid, so to speak, of the simple Jew.
You used something that reminded me. You said royal blue, and I thought to myself, where does royal blue come from? And let me read you from Wikipedia. Royal blue is a deep and vivid shade of blue. It is said to have been created by clothiers in Rhodes, Somerset, a consortium of who won a competition to make a dress for Queen Charlotte, consort of King Charles III. So isn't that interesting? Means even in England, there was significance to blue as being the royal color.
Well, absolutely. And in some of the readings that I've gone through this week, there was talk about during the Roman period already, only the Caesar was allowed even to wear it. So one cannot help but think of Exodus 19, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, that ultimately, this seamless transition from the Kohen wearing tekhelet, the tabernacle, the temple of God being really accented heavily in tekhelet, and then the simple Jew having that tekhelet. It seems to me overwhelming that the message is that you are a kingdom of priests in a sense, and that to me is very similar, like I said from the beginning, to the message that we might have taken last week, which is God says, build the temple, but I'm going to live in each one of you.
Right. I think that's beautiful. And of course, that relates to the fact that it's not only the Kohen, but it's also in the Talit. So we are a kingdom of priests, and therefore it starts with the priests, and then it goes to each and every one of us. It's such a nice idea, right? It flows so beautifully.
It flows, and you could say it's hermeneutics and parshanut and giving durash, but the truth is that the temple, the tabernacle, did not last. Tekhelet as a part of a temple and part of a priestly culture did not last. The remnant of it was in that thread. And so it's less of a commentary, but yes, I know when you look at it, you're supposed to remember the sea and the firmament and then God. But you can't help but also remember the rich history of it in the Torah itself, and that history carries on in each Jew. And I don't think that's hermeneutics. I think that's actually...
That's what it really means.
It was a material signification in a sense, and that is kind of fascinating.
You know, it's also interesting that for centuries, the tekhelet was lost. You know that, right? We didn't have tekhelet. About 25 years ago, there were two people, students of Rabbi Riskin in Efrat, who actually went diving in the sea off of Haifa, and they found what they claimed to be tekhelet. And today you can actually buy a talit with tekhelet in it.
So you're pushing us forward, Rabbi. I love it. We're going forward in the history of this, I wouldn't say idea, but a color. And yes, the Talmud does say that in the Midrash Tanchuma, it says that when there was real blue, but now we only have white because the blue has been hidden. Shahat-chelet nignaz. I always thought that it was obviously something that was extinct. And I always loved the concept of we are guardians of God's world. And if we don't take care of it, not only can we lose a species, we can lose a commandment. I mean, that's a big deal when one of the 613 commandments, you can't fulfill it anymore.
That's right.
So I always think there's a lesson there, and I was at the aquarium, and like any aquarium and any museum in Israel, during Chol HaMoed, Hasidim come and everybody comes,
right.
And I said, you have to have a whole area of this on tekhelet, because it's an aspect of Judaism that is connected to the world that we are the guardians of. So there's a whole separate mission there. But again, it's related, because just as the temple was lost, just as the Mishkan was lost, just as the Kohanim were lost, so the mollusk was lost. And I almost regret the fact that we, quote unquote, have refound it, because looking at the simple white talit reminds you as much of what is there as what is not there. And I think that's a beautiful message as well. But you're correct that this is an area where science impacts Judaism, discovery, and academics. It's fascinating. It's a beautiful, beautiful narrative, arc of history, so to speak. One other aspect of how it, quote unquote, was hidden was that because it was very expensive, on the one hand, it's a wonderful lesson that even though it's expensive, even though it's quote unquote royal blue, every Jew can have it. But at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, it's expensive. And what that meant was it created a situation for fake tekhelet. And I mentioned this a little bit when we discussed Korach, but Yigal Yadin, in a book on Bar Kokhba, was excavating a cave, and he found balls of wool that were blue. And he says, wow, this is amazing. Not only have I found tefillin, but I also found tekhelet, and it was clear that the zealots were keeping all of these commandments. And then he sent it to a lab, and the lab came back, and this is all in his footnotes. This is a general, an archaeologist, but he's tying it all into the Talmud. He says it was clear that this was not tekhelet. It was false tekhelet, and that probably the zealots were duped along with many other Jews in buying this from incorrect sources. And in the source sheet, I have places in the Talmud where it talks about this, but ultimately it is very possible that the rabbis, in order to stop corruption and to snuff out these black markets for fake tekhelet, said there's no mitzvah. And that's an amazing a lesson to take from this color. And again, it's the absence of the color that teaches us, but it is an amazing lesson.
That is an amazing lesson. That's right. I mean, let's just take a step back. The fact that the Talmud knows about fake tekhelet, so that kind of points to your idea that it was expensive and it was special, right? Because you only make replicas of things that are worth it, right? You only make replicas of things from Tiffany's, right? Things that are really worth it. So tekhelet obviously was something that was very, very special. And it's also interesting that it shows how important it was, how important people, that people could be duped. People aren't duped for just anything. People are duped for things they want. And what they wanted was tekhelet because that was the royal color.
Yes, so that is definitely a fascinating aspect. So I want to get back to kind of the verses that we talked about at the beginning when we were describing the fashion, so to speak. And it says, "V'asita tzitz," that you should make this frontlet. And then it talked about a patil tekhelet, a cord of blue. And those two words also are pregnant with fascinating meaning and history. So tzitz can mean wings. In Jeremiah, it says, "Tenu tzitz leMoav," give wings to Moav. And of course, those who know about the Hebrew for the commandment of tzitziot, it's on kanaf, the corners, but kanafayim is wings as well. So it kind of...
And explain, what does tzitz mean in this week's parsha?
So in this week's parsha, it means "V'asita tzitz zahav tahor," and you shall make a frontlet. Everett Fox says a flower or a gleamer, perhaps alluding to its shining quality or its shape of some kind.
And it went on his forehead.
Absolutely. Very similar to maybe where tefillin is. Again, getting...
I always thought that the tzitz was a funny thing. Can you imagine wearing a gold flower on your forehead?
Well, I mean, again, it's very similar to tefillin. And it's very similar to the headdress and the helmet that the Egyptians and maybe Sumerians wore. With the Egyptians, it had this snake coming out. But maybe it's the third eye. This seems to be, the forehead seems to be a place where there was embellishments, kamiot, magical things. So yes, to us it's probably strange, but I think it's a frontlet. It's not your license plate on the back. It's the way you go forward.
You look at the picture. The picture of the tzitz seems to be, it's very narrow. So maybe it's like the tefillin. Maybe they have the same idea that it's kind of just a more elaborate type of tefillin made out of gold.
No argument there for sure. But tzitz has another meaning as well. In Numbers 17, it says, "The next day Moses entered the tent of the pact, and there the staff of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted. It had brought forth sprouts, produced blossoms, and borne almonds." So this was a particular situation. But there it talks about v'yatzetz tzitz, produced blossoms. So we have the first image is one of soaring, of wings, of something that's shiny and translucent. And then we have this other aspect of tzitz as a blossom of life. And these, of course, you can't ignore the connection between tzitz and tzitziot as a sprout from the four corners of the garment. So we're playing with language again, how that commandment of tzitziot for the civilian Jew, if you will, connected with many of these concepts that we see regarding the priestly garments. And that to me is fascinating and kind of exciting.
That is really exciting. I think it's interesting because you start with something as kind of mundane as the color. Doesn't sound like it's going to be interesting, but there's so much richness in trying to figure out the color that it really brings the whole thing to life. And it really adds a different element. You know, usually when you learn Tetzaveh, you talk about the different articles of clothing, the things themselves. But thinking about the colors is really so much more striking because that's actually what people saw.
Well, absolutely.
That's what they were struck by.
We're getting towards the end of our half hour, and the subject of tonight was why blue and white. And we've talked a lot about the blue. We've even talked about the white, where the rabbi said once the blue was hidden, it's all white. But I, as you know, and you could probably sense when I quoted Yigal Yadin, the general and the archaeologist who knew his Talmud, somehow the Zionists, as secular as they were, understood this message, all the messages that we've talked about tonight. And when they picked the colors for the flag of Israel, which really, if you think about it, looks like that talit. It has those blue stripes on it. You call them a tzitz. When Rabbi Herzog made the prayer for the state of Israel, and in it, he played with this idea that we say every 3 times a day when we pray, and we talk about matzmiach Yeshua, that the deliverance should sprout. I just love that word, that, deliverance, you can say could explode, it could come out, but that deliverance should sprout is amazing to me. And of course, he said, Reishit tzmichat gulatenu.
I was going to say that's the same thing, right?
He took the same concept. So we've taken a history of a simple color and traced it through the ancient texts all the way to modern-day Israel. And it's an inspiration, hopefully, to us all. May you glow in the shine of the tekhelet this Shabbat. And join us next week. What do we have next week, Rabbi?
Next week we have the sin of the golden calf. There's so much next week. Wow, the breaking of the tablets and the sin of the golden calf. We're going to be busy all week preparing for next week.
I can't wait. Shabbat shalom to everybody, and have a great Shabbat. And see you all next week.